Hello and welcome to NTD Canada News Election Special Series. I'm your host, Gary Bai. On Sunday, Canadians across the country joined forces in the March for Freedom event, calling for the release of two Canadians arbitrarily detained in China, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Elections Canada's latest analysis shows 2 million to 3 million Canadians might choose to vote by mail in the upcoming federal election, or 11 to 16% of the votes if the voter turnout remains the same as the last election. Labor Day weekend is here, the unofficial end of summer. With 15 days left in the campaign, where are the leaders at in this critical juncture? Green Party leader Anne Paul has been canvassing with volunteers in Toronto. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet was in Val-d'Or, Quebec. The People's Party leader Maxime Bernier was in Penticton and Kelowna, British Columbia. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was in Ottawa making an announcement about his party's plans to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, with a plan to increase vaccination rates. The aim is to improve vaccination rates in remote areas of Canada with vaccine-hesitant groups. He said the party would put up $1 billion as a part of the strategy to remove barriers preventing the unvaccinated from getting a jab. He said he's also campaigning for the safety of the healthcare workers and has called for changes to the criminal code to protect people in the sector by making it an offense to impede or assault a worker in the course of their duties. A well-rested Justin Trudeau went on the attack Sunday while campaigning in Markham, Ontario. In 2020, the Liberal government banned 1,500 makes and models of what they dubbed military-grade assault-style firearms and promised to make it mandatory for owners of barred firearms to sell them back to the government or made inoperable. Trudeau has used this point to attack O'Toole and the Conservatives who have vowed to repeal C-71 and the Liberal order in council on outlawing the 1,500 firearms. Today, O'Toole reversed course on the campaign trail in Vancouver and said a Conservative government would keep in place the firearms ban while conducting a public review of the classification system. O'Toole said they will go after criminals and respect law-abiding gun owners and are proposing some new mandatory minimum sentences for the criminal use of guns. Supporters of two Canadians held in a Chinese prison for 1,000 days rallied on Sunday, September 5th, demanding the release in a case that has soured diplomatic ties between Ottawa and the Chinese Communist regime. Businessman Michael Spavor and former diplomat Michael Kovrig were detained in December 2018, shortly after Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei Technologies, on a U.S. warrant. The U.S. wants her extradited to face fraud charges. The detentions of Michaels were seen as an act of the Chinese Communist regime's diplomatic hostage-taking in revenge. Last month, a Chinese court sentenced Spavor to 11 years in prison for espionage. Meng is waiting a verdict on her U.S. extradition request after the hearing wrapped up in a British Columbia court last month. Several hundred people gathered at a park in Ottawa, with some wearing white shirts saying "March for the Michaels, 7,000 Steps for Freedom," and carrying a banner #BringThemHome. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Marc Garneau, who joined the rally, said in the statement, quote, "We strongly condemn the lack of a transparent legal process." He continued, "Arbitrarily detaining foreign citizens is unjust and immoral." Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has called a snap election for September 20th, is trailing his main opponent, Conservative Party leader Erin O'Toole, who has demanded a tougher approach against the CCP. During a campaign stop, when asked about criticism that his government had not done enough to free the two Michaels, Trudeau said when dealing with citizens in trouble abroad, quote, "There are also a lot of things we're doing in a less visible way with the American government, with partners and allies, and indeed putting pressure directly on the Chinese government as well."
So there are things that, as you point out, Annie, are very visible in what we have done, like getting dozens and dozens of countries to sign on to a declaration on arbitrary detentions, the pressure that different communities, different countries have put directly on China that they have talked about. There are also a lot of things we are doing in a less visible way with the American government, with partners and allies, and indeed putting pressure directly on the Chinese government as well. We will not rest until the two Michaels are once again home with their families.
Presumably, he's talking about Canada's leadership in an international coalition to combat hostage diplomacy. On Sunday, O'Toole said the Conservatives would stand up for the two Canadian citizens detained in China. He said the Conservatives would apply sanctions to the CCP, which will be, quote, meant to highlight the fact that the two Michaels are imprisoned as diplomatic pawns.
I don't call it a muscled approach to foreign affairs. I call it a serious approach, where we will stand up for our citizens, our economic interests, and our values as a country. And I've often said China might be much larger in terms of population and economy, but they can learn a lot from us with respect to engagement for human rights, dignity, and the rule of law. So our sanctions would be meant to highlight the fact that the two Michaels are in prison as diplomatic pawns. That is unacceptable for a country that projects itself as a world-leading country. We'd like to push the communist regime to do better, and our sanctions, we would also work with close countries to urge them to take a similar approach with respect to Magnitsky sanctions, but also with respect to trade, the situation in Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. It's time for a serious and principled Canada on the world stage again.
The Trudeau Liberals have been doing the tough maths to maintain a delicate connection with the Chinese Communist Party. On Saturday, the Globe and Mail reported new details on when Justin Trudeau visited China as Prime Minister for the first time in 2016. It said that he arrived with high expectations. He wanted to rekindle a relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, whose consumer markets and bulging capital accounts offered opportunities for Canadian commerce. Speaking to Xi Jinping in the Dao Yitai State Guest House in Beijing, Trudeau hoped to find common ground in trade and commerce. The Globe quoted a source who was in the room. Trudeau was saying that, like his father had helped China to rejoin the United Nations, he would help China to occupy its rightful place on the international scene. In 1970, the government of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau became one of the first Western governments to establish diplomatic relations with the CCP. After the Liberal Party won the 2015 federal election, it immediately began seeking closer ties with CCP, at one point even considering an extradition treaty with the regime. The government also spent money on public relations initiatives to warm Canadians to the idea of having closer ties with the CCP. Trudeau visited China in 2016 and 2017, pursuing preliminary talks towards a free trade agreement, despite a $50 billion imbalance in trade between the two countries in the CCP's favor. The talks failed in 2017 after the CCP didn't want to entertain Trudeau's request to consider the progressive values in the deal. The same year, Canada committed hundreds of millions of dollars in investment in CCP's prestige-building initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, meant to rival other multilateral development banks such as the World Bank. The Liberal government allowed the takeover of two security-sensitive high-tech companies by Chinese companies. One was Norsat, a Vancouver-based satellite communications firm, and the other was ITF Technologies, a Montreal-based laser technology company. In 2016, Trudeau's attendance at Cash for Access events, charging $1,500 per person, became a source of controversy. One of the guests, an advisor to the Chinese regime, donated $1 million to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation and the University of Montreal Faculty of Law, where Pierre Trudeau had taught. However, this had all changed with the detentions of the two Michaels. The cases of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have shed light on the volatile temperament of the CCP, as well as the regime's complete disregard for basic human rights. The Trudeau government has suspended its extradition treaty with Hong Kong after the city's autonomy was taken apart by the CCP's national security law. However, it has yet to rule out including Chinese telecom giant Huawei's equipment in Canada's 5G networks, despite security concerns from the intelligence community. Trudeau's government has also ignored warnings on the influence of CCP-affiliated organizations in Canadian universities. It did not impose retaliatory trade measures after the CCP blocked imports, according to the Globe. Ottawa continues to tread cautiously when it comes to the CCP, according to the Globe. Lynette Ong, a political scientist at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy who specializes in China issues, said, "The Liberal government was caught unprepared and had no strategy in place when the relations turned sour quickly after the Munk case," referring to the detainment of the two Michaels. After the election was called, the Conservative Party soon released its platform, which takes a strong stance against the CCP, outlined specific provisions to separate from the Chinese Communist Party. The platform prescribes measures to withdraw from the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, ban Huawei from Canada's 5G infrastructure, and further investigate the company's role in providing surveillance capabilities that have been used against persecuted minorities in China. Advise universities against partnerships with China's state-controlled companies and organizations, and prohibit federal granting councils from participating in these partnerships. Cracking down on China's foreign influence operations on Canadian soil, which includes revoking the licenses of China's state-run and state-controlled broadcasters that spread disinformation, banning senior public office holders for 5 years after leaving office, including former prime ministers, from employment or contracts with China's government or an entity controlled by China's government, revoking visas of Chinese nationals conducting espionage or stealing intellectual property. And coming up, we talk about the details on mail-in voting. But please first subscribe if you're new to this channel and turn on that notification bell so you won't miss any new videos. We'll be bringing you election updates from coast to coast in the coming weeks, along with the latest news coverage. Thank you for your support. Now let's get back to our stories. Elections Canada's latest analysis shows 2 million to 3 million Canadians might choose to vote by mail in the upcoming election. This equals 11 to 16% of votes if the voter turnout remains the same as in the last election. Mail-in voting, sometimes called vote by mail, was first introduced to Canada in 1993 through Bill C-114. However, the mail-in ballots were not widely adopted in the past elections. In the 2019 election, only about 50,000 Canadians voted by mail, and most of them were abroad. The forecasted surge of mail-in votes in the coming election will be the first substantive implementation in Canada. Compared with vote in person, mail-in voting requires the voter to pay attention to every detail. In a phone interview, Deputy Chief Electoral Officer Michael Russell said, quote, "We will insist that the moment the election is called, that if you plan to vote by mail, start now because it is complicated." Since mail-in votes will be counted only after Election Day, it could take 2 to 5 days to finish the counting, according to Stéphane Perrault, the Chief Electoral Officer for Elections Canada. Counting the mail-in votes could cause days of delay in declaring winners if the race is tight. Regarding the concern over security of mail-in voting, Matthew McKenna, a spokesman for Elections Canada, in her interview explained Canada's mail-in voting system is much different from that used in U.S. elections. For example, Canada's electoral system is administered by a centralized body, and the option of mail-in voting must be requested by an individual voter in Canada. McKenna expects Canadians to have more confidence in mail-in ballots. However, the Canadian mail-in ballots are not free from concerns. Professor Alexandra Essex of Western University is an expert in cybersecurity and vulnerabilities to election tampering. Essex suggests members within the family and friend circle may direct others to vote for certain candidates. Vote buying and vote gifting are also hypothetically possible in mail-in voting. Although Essex agreed that Canadian federal elections are administered more securely, he considers vote by mail not as secure as in-person voting, and it could be a problem if the majority of the election was done by mail-in voting. Although mail-in voting is being considered by some voters due to the COVID pandemic, Elections Canada assures the public of the safe environment at polling stations. Perrault said, quote, "These are the same people that you meet every day at the grocery store. The difference is that the polls are a controlled environment where safety measures can be applied more rigorously." He also indicated that for elections taking place in the last 18 months in Canada and in the world, there have not been outbreaks of COVID as a result of in-person voting. With that said, thank you for watching NTD Canada News. If you like this video, please give us a like and share. It will help more people see our channel. We'll be back with more comprehensive election coverage. And we'll see you next time.